And well, you're very generous with your applause. Should I go through various cities and see how they're doing? So last time, I was in Lisbon and I went with Joshua Davis. We went to see the castle up on the hill, the South Shore. And one of the interesting things of that castle was that this was clearly a military building, built in the supposedly dark Middle Ages for one reason only, to shoot big cannonballs against invading army. And the surprising thing of it was that even though this was a military compound, it was actually designed quite beautifully. So even from the, it looks pretty good from here, but then when you look closely, like this is one of the entrances, it's pretty gorgeous, it's symmetrical. And then even if you looked at the doorknobs, every single doorknob in that place was really covered with ornaments. And if you look, you're missing something somewhere else, clearly. Sounds much more exciting than whatever I have to say here about beauty. So, you now still have a chance. I mean, maybe I'll go Okay, let's join the internet here that we can't join. Let's see if we can get rid of this. Seems that we can't. And okay, so we have been here and here. So basically, even the cannons themselves were very good looking. They had ornaments, zizzled rings on them, and thank you very much. They're actually seeing what we're seeing, and they just loved my slide so much. Right after, and I think that's why I was impressed by it, right after Lisbon, I went to Memphis, Tennessee to do another talk. And in this time, it was at the Cook Convention Center in Memphis. And this is how it looks at the Cook Convention Center. If you stand outside, you can look upside, you can look downside. And basically, nothing that I saw here was designed with any sort of formal decision-making in place. But there was just, basically everything was pure functionality. And the same was true for the inside, the convention center. The only thing that survived from the rich musical history of Memphis, you can see here in these musical notes woven into this carpet. Elvis had clearly left that building quite a while ago. This is the place that he put me in. That's the Marriott Hotel, and it says on the website, it's always a problem if it needs to have that tagline on your hotel site. In any case, so I was wondering, what was the reason? Like, what actually brought us from the supposedly dark ages of the Middle Ages, that was the place in Lisbon, to the clearly much darker places of the 20th century in Memphis, Tennessee. And I actually myself really blame one single person. Here he is. He's a fellow Austrian architect, lived, born in 1880, lived in the beginning, or towards the end of the 19th century, when in Vienna, but in other places in the world, the historicism style ruled. So at that time, you had, if you went to the main avenue in Vienna, the Ringstrasse, you had fake Gothic built right next to fake Greek, right next to fake Renaissance. And those basically wanted to get rid of that, and he wrote a pamphlet and I did a talk, similar to this one. It was called Ornament and Crime. And in it he said, for one thing, clearly it's criminal because just look at the people who have tattoos. They're all ornamental, they're all criminals, so case closed, number one. Number two, he thought it was criminal to force craftspeople to make ornaments on tools, because clearly those ornaments would be fashionable, and so the tools would be obsolete much, much faster. And that's just one of his sayings, was that now that we are the beginning of the 20th century, with modernism, we have to get rid of all of that ornamentation. And that's one of the villas that he built. And his more famous one, the Loshaus on Michaelerplatz, apparently hated by the Austrian emperor so much that he had all the windows that overlooked this building nailed shut so he didn't have to see it. And it was subsequently called the building without eyebrows by the Viennese, because it was so unusual for the time to have such a relatively blank facade without all of that ornamentation. Now, of course, Adolf Loos turned out to be a major influence on the German Bauhaus, and you had on Walter Gropius, on Le Corbusier, and on Mies van der Rohe. He was. And they, of course, wound up to build a whole bunch of real masterpieces, but then also those ideas were translated in sort of really stupefying sameness that basically covered the entire world, both in capitalist and in communist societies, and we saw much of that pretty much anywhere around the world. Corbusier himself, of course, very famously wanted to bulldoze Paris. He really did, and basically replaced it with his own ideas. The Parisian airport Charles de Gaulle, was supposed to be right smack in the city center, so he envisioned airplanes landing right in between these buildings. And of course, there's this old joke that says, you know, what's the difference between Corbusier and God? And the answer is that Corbusier never thought, God never thought that he's Corbusier. Now, of course, God himself actually hated modernism. The reason we know that for sure is because God actually wrote a book. Oh my God, this is back. So God is fucking with me here too. Okay, so we'll have, let's turn the Wi-Fi off. Okay, that will do this. Excellent, thank you for the tip. And we go right back here. So, as I said, God wrote the book. And in this book, actually, God reveals himself as a designer of lighting fixtures. That is absolutely true. If you look at in Exodus 25:31, God very clearly writes, "Of beaten work shall the candlestick be made. 3 branches out on the one side, and 3 branches out of the other, with bowels made onto like almonds, with a knob and a flower in one branch, and 3 bowels made to look like almonds in the other branch." So this is pretty much a manufacturing blueprint for this lighting fixture to be made. This is how it actually looks like, and clearly God was not a modernist. Of course, Corbusier also wrote the book, fairly successful, but God outsold him by a multitude. Now, very clearly, there is beauty in modernism. Now, if you look at this Ellsworth Kelly piece, I actually do find that gorgeous. But it seems to me that for every good piece like the Seagram building on 5th Avenue in New York, or Park Avenue in New York, that we get hundreds of these kind of pieces of shit somewhere in Queens or somewhere else. And the ideas that the original modernists had really were transformed into this sort of economic modernism that really covered the world in incredible sameness. You had these things going on in Russia. At one time, over 600 million apartments were built in that style. So you still have a choice. It sounds pretty exciting out there. So at one time, over 600 million, a significant amount of the world population basically living in apartments like this. And of course, the only reason these things were built was functionalism. That was the complete idea. We don't give a shit about how it looks, we don't give a shit about the culture, we want to get as many people housed as cheaply as possible. And the result, of course, was that these things did one thing not, they did not function. Like that relentless pursuit of functionalism turned in exactly the opposite thing. Like nobody wanted to live in them. Like they were actually not functioning for human beings, not fit for human housing. So if you look at those four guys, an Austrian, a Swiss, and two Germans, how the fuck did these four guys convince the world that everything should look exactly like they said that they tell the world to do? They did it with a term they invented called the international style. Now this thing made sense after World War I. You know, the idea was if we're all a little bit more similar, maybe we wouldn't hate each other that much. But it didn't quite work out that way. And it was unbelievably successful. What used to look like this in China, now it looks like this. Used to look like this in South Africa, now it looks like this in Cape Town. Used to be like this in Indonesia, now it looks like this in Jakarta. Turkey, Istanbul looks like now. And of course, it worked by far the best in Germany, because after World War II, everything was destroyed, so there was a lot of stuff to build, and what was built was boxes. Like boxes after boxes after boxes and boxes. And I, of course, immediately thought, well, like, you know, World War II, these guys must have been the liberals, they were probably the anti-Nazis, so they also were on the forefront, because when the Nazis were defeated, these liberal avant-garde architects came to the forefront. But not so. Not so. There is a letter from Mies van der Rohe in the Bauhaus archive where he offers Hitler his services. It was just Hitler didn't quite like that stuff. Corbusier worked extensively for the Vichy government, for the Nazi government that occupied Paris, extensively, and got away with it. Absolutely amazing. And of course the results we all know. If I take a trip from Athens, let's say to Bangkok, and maybe go onwards to Sapporo, and back onward to Sofia, I really need to check my boarding pass to make sure that I realize in what city that I'm in, because clearly you would have no clue from the local architecture that is offered to me. And the same is true for subway systems. If I pick one, but I could pick any subway system anywhere around the world that was built after modernism. I just happened to pick Munich. If I take the idea seems to be that every subway station has to look the same, because that's clearly the most functional way to build a subway system. So if you go from Hauptbahnhof in Munich to Karl-Preis-Platz, to Theresienstraße, to Messestadt Ost, or Fraunhofer Straße, you always have the same impression. If you're reading the paper or doing something, you really have to squint your eyes and figure out where you are to figure out in what station you need to get out. Easy, Bahnhof. Now, how unbelievably, utterly, crazily stupid that is, what fuck in the head all these people are, that they all replicate this idiocy around the world, you see when you visit Moscow, where they built the subway system before the modernists had any sort of say in it. So you go from one subway system to another subway station, to another subway station. Not only is this much more gorgeous and much more beautiful, but it also works much better. Because if you actually sit in the subway and you read a paper, just basically out of the corner of your eye, you will know when your station comes. You don't have to squint and see, or don't have to listen to some shitty announcer to tell you where you are, but it's basically clear just by the feeling, because they had the great idea to give every subway station to a different architect. And it really works so much better. Now, if I look at the town that has been my hometown for the last 25 years, if I look at New York City, there is actually a wonderful little map out there that some scientists in New England put together. It's from the New England Complex Systems Institute. And they do a map of Manhattan in real time that shows you the sentiment of Manhattan, how happy or unhappy people are at any given time of the day using Twitter. They have a little analytical program in there. What are the Twitter messages positive coming from that space, or are they negative? So this is Midtown Manhattan. You see over there, there is like something between 33rd Street and 35th Street. People aren't quite happy about it. Now, what could that possibly be? There are two stations, two public train stations in Manhattan. This is Penn Station, renovated in the 70s, used to be gorgeous, now looks like this. And then there is Grand Central Station on 42nd Street, 19th century building, renovated into still into a 19th century building, looks like this. If you look at the sentiment map of Manhattan, Grand Central, just as happy as the rest of the bunch of surroundings. Penn Station, not quite so much. And this is very much in my neighborhood. I live on 14th Street. These are buildings basically a couple of blocks away from myself. We'll do a little quiz. These are two buildings right next to each other. One of these buildings is an art museum. The other building is a ventilation tower for a car tunnel. So let's say, who thinks number one is the art museum? More about 200 people. Who thinks number two is the art museum? I would say roughly the same. So it's even. So the one on the left is the art museum, the one on the right is the ventilation tower. It's the one on the left opened a month ago, it's the New Whitney Museum of American Art. The one on the right is a 19th century copy of an industrial building. I have to admit, the Whitney Museum is actually pretty good from the inside. So it's actually quite beautiful from the inside. But it's still amazing that an international competition about the best architects in the world would result in a building where a room full of design-centric people can't make the difference, can't see the difference between that and a Holland Tunnel ventilation tower. And so let's quickly go into the 19th century, which of course was totally obsessed by beauty. It was one of its main philosophers, G.E. Moore, basically put beauty on the same level as goodness. It was a real value, very different from other aesthetic values, very different from, let's say, from structure or form. Beauty was really its own super value. And there were people like Feuerbach who basically built their entire career on beauty. That's basically all that they were interested in. And I think interestingly, I found that out very recently when I went to Munich, and there is a museum there totally dedicated to 19th century art. And I was wondering, why is it that I'm so interested in beauty, and I like so little in the museum that's dedicated to the art that's from the century that was completely obsessed with beauty. And I think it's the same idea that if you go after something that's complex, with a single thing, you don't reach it. And most of the art in the 19th century, I would know that was made for no other reason than to make it gorgeous and beautiful, actually is not quite beautiful. It's more like kitsch, more like this stuff. that they didn't quite reach in the same way that the modernists didn't reach functionalism. And the reason, of course, this all stopped was World War I, with this incredible amount of atrocities that disappointed so many people in the populations and so many artists, that these supposedly civilized nations went after each other and killed each other in the most gruesome and the most brutal, just the most awful kind of way. And this sort of made way for maybe the main artist that really stopped all that, which was, Marcel Duchamp, who, famously in 1917 designed this, or made this ready-made, took a urinal, signed it with a different name, dated it and said, this is art. And it is very specifically non-aesthetic art. He wanted to get the beauty outside of art. And some of his collectors actually didn't quite believe it. He said, well, look at these beautiful lines, look how it shines down there. Isn't it sort of like Brancusi-like? Isn't it beautiful? And Duchamp had to come out and say, no, this is not Brancusi-like. This has nothing to do with that stuff. This is really about taking aesthetics out of all that stuff. And I can understand that, and that made a lot of sense in 1917. If you look at the other really big artists of the 20th century, Warhol had sort of a similar direction originally with the sort of like his celebration of the banal, of the commercial, of the Brillo boxes. And if you look at the exhibition that he actually did, the Brillo box was only one of the many boxes that he originally exhibited, but strangely, the Brillo box is really the only one that became part of art history. In the original exhibition, he had a Kellogg's Cornflakes box, he had the Del Monte peach half that you see here, he had Heinz ketchup, and a good number of others. But it was only the Brillo box that we really know now as this big deal in art history. Now, if you do a little research, it turns out that the Brillo box was designed by an abstract expressionist painter, by a guy that Warhol really wanted to fight, that all the pop artists, they hated the expressionists. They thought, they were too much still concerned with beauty, we have to do the commercial. But actually, this painter, his name is James Harvey, didn't quite make enough money doing his abstract expressionists, and on the weekends and in the evening, sort of like moonlighted as a graphic designer, and he designed the Brillo box. So in some very strange way, even though Warhol wanted to negate the beauty of it, it sort of creeped into pop art again through the back door. And then of course, that the more often now pop art very much, specifically Lichtenstein or also Warhol, is very much seen as something beautiful, because if you show something long enough, we can, of course, see it as beautiful, and you see that quite well, even, let's say, if you look at Damien Hirst's fly painting that clearly originally was made more with the emotion of disgust in mind rather than beauty. But there is, if you go close and you see the structure of all these dead flies, of course, there is also something quite gorgeous about it. And I have absolutely nothing against shock and disgust as strategies in contemporary art, or even as strategies in design. I think they're completely, utterly fine. But what I'm saying is that it's absolutely, utterly crazy that we've had that for 100 years, and there is basically nobody, there is not a single contemporary artist who is important that I know of, who really utterly comes out and talks about beauty, or talks about the importance of beauty. And it's the same with high-end design. There is just no, not that I would know of, a real big high-end designer who talks about beauty non-ironically and really says that this is of some sort of importance. Most designers that I hear, that I see at conferences, say like, oh, of course, we are not about making things look good. Like, that's not really our concern. And I think my point is, maybe it's time that this should become our concern again. I actually like these guys. They're Austrian. They sort of like say it's the last hooray for disgust and shock. You know, they made this type that they shed originally. In my hometown, they had an exhibition where they found a guy that they put hard-boiled eggs up his ass, and then he shed it on Easter Sunday, so it was the Easter Bunny kind of thing. And since my hometown in Austria is very conservative, it worked, meaning the director of the museum almost got fired, people were very upset, it still worked. But ultimately, these tendencies or these strategies, we've had them too long. Most of them are now boring, and I think Shedetin, who is the artist group who does that, would be the first to admit that the strategy of disgust now is kind of a difficult one to pull off. But even if you look at, maybe the biggest artist in the United States right now, even Jeff Koons could make his career with kitsch, but he couldn't really make it with beauty. It has to be an ironic stance that you're sort of like away from it. You couldn't really come out properly. And so this is quickly an aside about another Austrian artist. This was a guy that was huge when I was an art student, and we hated him. This was like to admit that you like Hundertwasser would have been like the most uncool thing that you could possibly do as an art student in Vienna in the 80s. Like, it would have been more popular to join Hitler Youth than to admit that you like anything that Hundertwasser did. And the worst of his offenses, we thought, was this thing, which basically was a regular recycling plant that he beautified, which of course we thought was an unbelievable crime. Like, he didn't really change any of the content, any of the mechanics of this recycling plant. All he did was he covered it with his kind of ornamentation. And now, of course, I had some experience, I'm much older, and I completely, utterly changed my mind on this. I mean, I don't think that this is a particular fantastic building, but I think it's much better than these that are also standing around in Austria and have not been beautified. They're just like anywhere, and we didn't protest as art students against these. We just thought that Hundertwasser did a horrible job with it. And that some of it really was influenced last year by my stay in Rome. I had a little scholarship that I could stay in a beautiful villa in Rome for 2 months over the last summer. And that villa was right next to the main cemetery in Rome. And this cemetery really was a revelation for me, because it so clearly showed what a fantastic possibility beauty can actually be in flowers to grapes that are beautiful, to somehow ease the pain, to transform something that is completely, utterly filled with grief and misery into something that's a little lighter. Not joy for sure, but maybe that's just sorrow. And beauty plays a really significant role in helping us do that. Very sort of like along those lines, because I did change my mind. We here and there now slowly in the studio take beauty more seriously. And I'll show you just 1 or 2 city projects. Some of you might have seen this. This was made in Amsterdam a couple of years ago, where we got a plaza and the city of Amsterdam just said, do something. They had a very small budget, I think it was 6,000 euros. We went to the central bank in Amsterdam. They changed the 6,000 euros into 600,000 euro coins for us, and they are very organized in Amsterdam, so they could give us brand new ones, medium used ones, and quite old ones. So we had 3 different colors of these, and the plaza itself already had these stone plates on it, so it came with a ready-made grid, and with the help of 100 volunteers, we carefully laid out these 600,000 euro coins So by the end of the week, it actually said, obsessions make my life worse and my work better. And we made it beautiful on purpose, or we made it as beautiful as we could at the time with this kind of ornamental typography, because we wanted the viewer to have to make a decision. Like, do I take as many coins as I want, as I can, or do I want to keep the piece intact? And we painted the backside of the coins in a very specific bright blue, so we could track them, and we had a website built up, and we wanted to sort of like track them all over Europe. You can use those coins everywhere and see where they would go. What really happened was that as soon as the piece was done, a guy came, as we had expected it, with big plastic bags, and he shoveled as many coins as he could into the plastic bags to carry away. And one of the neighbors, there are buildings on the left, on the top, and on the right. One of the neighbors who had watched us putting the coins up and who had kind of like fell and fallen in love with the piece, thought this is outrageous, and she called the police. And the Dutch police, in all of their infinite wisdom, thought, well, clearly this is a piece of art, this needs to be protected, so they swept it all up and took it into protection at police quarters in Amsterdam. So basically what you see here is like us, trying to build it up over that whole week, but the whole piece really only lasted 3 or 4 hours. And there was no website needed, there was no dispersion plan ever gone, because I think that after a while in here, you just see the police coming, and I think it's maybe day 4 or day 5. It's still gated because we wanted it to be done first, because before people could take it. And yes, that's the cops sweeping it all up and bringing it into police headquarters. So all that was left over after a couple of hours were things. So. Second project, this is very recently in New York City. This is the BQE, the Brooklyn Queens Expressway overpass in Dumbo, in a fairly nice neighborhood in Brooklyn now, that was just people peed in it. So there was an organization there who had a little bit of money, $5,000 to be exact. They contacted us and said, we have $5,000, could you do something in this overpass that might stop people from using it as a urinal? And we didn't want to put any, do not piss here thing. So we thought, let's just beautify the space. That's really all we wanted to do. And as you can see, there is a kind of crappy bike path. There is people walking, and there's car traffic. So we needed something that would work for all 3 transportation modes, something for the car that you could see very quickly, and something that for the people who walk, that would still have some intricacy. And so basically on the left side of this underpass, we just put a giant yes here. The illustration was done by Yuko. Some of you might recall her from a previous OFF. And then on the other side, on the right side, it's just the same yes, but very, very clearly for the car traffic. And what happened is, people actually stopped peeing in it. And not only did they stop peeing, they started getting married in front of it. So it transformed from a pissoir into a wedding chapel. Which brings us back to the original pissoir. 1917. I mean, we've had 100 years of it. So I think there would be time to basically introduce something new. And I have a friend, a psychologist in the UK called Chris McManus, and he devised a wonderful little test that he was friendly, nice enough to give to me so we can do this test with you. He looked at aesthetics using another famous modernist, one of the most famous modernists of them all, Mondrian. And he took an original Mondrian, and then he had a fake made of that Mondrian. So what you're looking here, one of these things is an original, and one of these things is a fake. So, from your right-hand side, if the right one is fake, raise your hand. Quite a lot of people. If the left is fake, raise your hand. Much, much fewer people. Clearly. But let's do the double test. Let's try another one. Okay. If the right is fake, raise your hand. Few people. If the left is fake, raise your hand. Right again. So clearly, when I saw this test for the first time, I thought, well, maybe it's the golden means, like they get so used to these proportions. But Mondrian actually did not work in the golden means. What we do know is that he worked his ass off to make this really, really good. And we know because we can actually x-ray his paintings, and we see that he carefully moved these lines around until he thought this was the most optimum, the most pretty, the most beautiful composition. And clearly, an audience, we inherently know that what is beautiful and what is not. Now, if you look at a German philosopher who talks quite a lot about beauty, sort of like the last big philosopher who really concerned himself with beauty, because beauty didn't just get unfashionable in contemporary art and in design. It also got incredibly unfashionable in philosophy. So Hegel actually very much talks about the difference between natural beauty and man-made beauty. And he thinks that man-made beauty is superior. He thinks that, because if you look at a field of dandelions, natural, it's quite gorgeous, but then if you look at a painted field of dandelions, he thinks that thing is superior because it can only be understood with the intellect, so it's somehow of a higher order of beauty than just a natural beauty. And then, of course, if you go with this artist, Wolfgang Leitner, who actually collects over months dandelion pollen and then goes it through a sieve again in the gallery. There's another step of intellect involved here, and it is the end result of this dandelion pollen is absolutely gorgeous. And I think I agree there with Hegel. This is the valley that goes in from my hometown in Austria, the Bregenzer Wald, which, as you can see, is absolutely gorgeous. And if I go there for a little hike with my sister, there's definitely, if it's just the right day with the right light, there can be moments of awe. When I look out over the mountains and I'm like, I'm so glad I'm here, it's just incredible how beautiful this is. I'm in awe, in the very true sense of the word. But then, if I do this, interestingly, if I go up on the roof of my building in New York, I can actually have completely the same feeling, the same sort of awe, just looking over the New York skyline. And if I compare them, New York was built in 250 years. The Alps took 250 million years to build the Bregenzer Wald. So I'm even more in awe because basically we made this and we made it in absolute record time. And if I look at how Manhattan really developed, the left is how it looked like when it was bought from the Indians, and the right is how it looks like right now. I have to admit, and I'm sure that many of you wouldn't agree with me, but I have to admit that I actually prefer the one on the right much more towards the one on the left. The one on the left is kind of like bushland, with a little bit of a meadow inside, not very interesting. The one on the right, just in my opinion, is one of the best cities on earth. And I'll give you another example going further back. There is a tool that we as human beings used by far the most and by far the longest of any tool ever invented. and it's the stone axe. We started using it 1 million years ago, and we used it until about 40,000 years ago. There are hundreds of thousands of these stone axes found. Actually, they are so common that I bought one not long ago for $250 on eBay. I'm not 100% sure if it's really original, but it was claimed that it was original. They were found in Africa, they were found in Europe, they were found in the Americas, and basically all of them are perfectly symmetrical. Now, from a pure functioning point of view, there is no reason why they would have to be perfectly symmetrical. You could skin that mammoth just as well with something that is not symmetrical. So it was made symmetrical because it was better looking, because they liked it better. And there are actually many stone axes found that have no function. They are so tiny or so big that you couldn't even lift them. So they are made for pure aesthetic reasons. Some of these things are 1 million years old. This is before we were humans, meaning that before we were properly called Homo sapiens, our predecessors already made these perfectly symmetrical stone axes, way before we had language. So very clearly, what is so often dismissed as, oh, we're not about making things look good. It's completely, utterly within us. It's part of what it means to be human. And to disregard it is idiotic. And I can tell you the reason why I'm standing here making this a subject for an hour is simply experience, because I'm older than most of you. And in our graphic design work, I just found that when we actually spend some time, quote, making it look good, it worked much better. It just did. It's like basically whenever we did something that really worked, it was mostly stuff that we also spent some serious time making it look beautiful. So that's just another one of these. Okay. Let's go back to Adolf Loos. The truth, of course, is that Adolf Loos was not against beauty. If you look at this glass that he designed in 1923, and that is still in production by the same company that actually made that glass originally, it's clearly a beautiful glass. And there's a whole row of them. And most interestingly, the owner of this company, the grandson of the guy who commissioned Adolf Loos to design these glasses, looked through the safe of his company and found this letter from Adolf Loos for his granddad, where he says in German, I can translate it, I can also see tiny little pieces of ornaments put into the bottom of these glass. Like I could see butterflies, or maybe the human naked figure, or small animals. So the author of Ornament and Crime suggested to his client that in the second bit, the grandson Flobmeier contacted my studio to design these ornaments for the guy who wrote Ornament and Crime. And we, of course, thought long and hard what it could possibly be, what kind of ornaments that would still be within his will, so maybe the human naked figure, maybe small animals, what could it possibly be? And we ultimately, because we wanted this to be a dinner conversation kind of thing, settled on the idea of designing 7 glasses about the 7 deadly sins and 7 glasses about the 7 heavenly virtues. So you have, on the sin side, you have 7 glasses that are greed, gluttony, lust, pride, wrath, sloth, and envy. And on the positive side, on the heavenly virtues, you have humility, chastity, charity, diligence, temperance, and patience. And ultimately, of course, the thing is, the war really, or the question is really not about simple versus ornamental. but the real question is really about, is something done with no love and care, or is something done that has a lot of love put into it? And I actually think that, after all, this doomsaying, that things really do actually become better. If I look in my neighborhood, some of you might have heard of this, this is right 2 blocks from my home, a formerly elevated train track, the very, very logo of a functional building. You know, all they needed to do was to put goods in and out as fast and quickly as possible, was empty or was unused for about 25 years until 2 guys, Robert Hammond and another Joshua Davis, came along, hired 2 friends of mine, Rick Diller and Liz Cofidio, as architects, and transformed this thing into the High Line, which is this skinny park that goes from 12th Street all the way up to 35th Street now, is absolutely gorgeous and is completely amazing in its numbers, that it's now been 5.5 years old, with millions and millions and millions of people visiting it. It's a total utter success. But there hasn't been a single crime reported on the High Line since its existence. And that, of course, has something to do with its beauty. It also is very clear that because the High Line is beautiful, the architects who built next to it built better buildings. So along the High Lines, the buildings actually are remarkably good. And it's so very, very clear that if you look at the crime numbers, it's so obvious that beauty really is part of that function. It has nothing to do with something being cheap or just on the surface. And we see really much more of this if I look at the absolute gorgeousness of this James Turrell installation in Houston, Texas, where you look up into the sky and you see that little square that's empty, where you see the night sky go darker and darker and darker. And it never really turns from dark blue into black. It's just the dark blue becomes darker blue and darker blue until it's the darkest dark blue you could possibly have ever seen, because it's made by the universe. It's not printable, it's not dyeable, it's not paintable. It's the fucking universe that makes the blue, and that is just absolutely amazing and has a gorgeousness that is mind-blowing. And if you ever are in Houston, Texas, this alone is worthwhile to go and see. And if you're closer to here, I just was at the building site of this new Philharmonic space in Hamburg. It's not quite done yet, has many problems, costs overrun, it's much too late. Still, I think it's worthwhile. It's going to be one absolutely gorgeous building, as you see even here in the mock-ups. And even closer to home, Michael Arrett's memorial for 9/11 that I actually was often against because it was so incredibly expensive, turned out to be really beautiful and a real functional beauty, because it's incredibly loud. All those water going down makes incredible noise, so you have the possibility to be in the center of New York and you don't hear any traffic. Even if there are kids around who don't understand the memorial, who play and make noise, you don't hear them, and you have a complete choice to really go into yourself and actually think about what happened, or you cannot. But it is a real functioning way to serve beauty. And of course, because I run a small design company together with Jessica Walsh, we wanted to make a little bit piece of type that basically says exactly that now is better, that things do get better, and I just run that. This has been all shot in camera, so there is no computer graphics involved here.
won't you leave? Why won't you leave? Why won't you leave? But I have a way of seeing these things. Excuse